All right, welcome back, AP World. All right, so last section we talked about was the perks or the motives for imperialism and why Europe was able to dominate because of technology. And so I just wanted to start by doing a quick review. This is a Maxim machine gun. And so look at the amazing rate of fire that can produce. A couple hundred British soldiers against thousands of Zulu warriors who are carrying, leather shields. It doesn't take a lot of imagination to see the devastation that exists. These are Japanese warships. So again, think of Japan 40 years before this point had no navy and had samurai riding around on horseback. Well, because they copied the technology of the West, by 1905 they had a dominant navy that was able to embarrass the Russians in the Russo-Japanese War, which we'll get to in a little bit. All right, so let's keep rolling. All right, so let's look at actual examples of imperialism. How did this actually play out? And so we're going to begin our look by something called the Great Game, which is a fancy little term to talk about the rivalry or the competition to colonize Asia. Now, I don't really want to go over all of this, but really what I want to stress is that England was a dominant force. They had been a dominant force. They were still the industrial leaders of the world. They were imperial leaders of the world. And so they were kind of like on the mountain, the apex. And the rest of Europe and eventually America, Japan, they're all trying to catch up to England. And France was one of the first nations to really try to flex on or pose on the British Empire. So Napoleon, right, had tried to invade Egypt, actually was semi-successful in taking over, but eventually long term that kind of fails. They tried to take over India, that failed. And so France shifts its focus on something called Indochina. So really we're looking at Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand, Laos, Southeast Asia. And there they find success. And so even still today, right, when we look at like the Vietnam War, for example, it was really a war between the ethnic Vietnamese and their French colonial overlords, and then America gets involved. Okay, so what does France do? Well, much like the way Britain treated its colonies, France decided to set up schools, force people to learn French. They ruled with like a partnership with the local upper class or the educated elite. What was kind of unique about the French, made them unlike the British, was that they used Catholicism very heavily in a way of blending culture or winning the Indo-Chinese into European culture. And so even still, again, in the 20th and 21st century, it is not uncommon. In Vietnam, there's a very high Catholic population still today, stemming back to the 19th century Jesuit conversions. All right, Russia at this time, we've talked about before, right? They're looking to expand their empire. They had stopped Napoleon earlier in the 1800s. They fought in the Crimean War to expand further south into the Black Sea. And now that the Ottomans and the Qing Empire are sick and kind of dying, in that void, Russia's expanding down into those places. So areas like Afghanistan, Turkmenistan, right? Uzbekistan across the Great Central Plateau. They're expanding into those regions. They've expanded to the Pacific Ocean in the Kamchatka Peninsula. And so they're pushing. And that will put them into direct conflict with Japan eventually as their ambitions collide. Spain has had, a great empire for many, many hundreds of years at this point, but they're sick and dying. They'll come crashing into the United States in the Spanish-American War. We'll look at later. The Dutch are still out there. The Netherlands still looking for trade in luxury commodities. And then the British, right? The British are just never sleeping. They never rest. The sun never sets on the British Empire. And so in order to not fall behind in Southeast Asia, they continue the game by expanding through Burma, down into Singapore, and eventually taking over Malaya, Malaysia, as we would know it. And that gave them militarily an advantage by controlling the shipping lanes through the Straits of Malacca and the South China Sea, which protected India and their opium trade to China. And so that was a great advantage to them. And so some images to kind of bail it out here. So there's Russian expansion south and into the Pacific, as I mentioned before, and there's America getting involved. Okay, I have almost nowhere to hide. I'm going to go over here for a little bit. All right, so let's look at another specific example. So in India, India is known as the crown jewel of the British Empire for a reason. It's the area that Britain cared the most about. It was the most productive colony they had. Look at them milking the resources out of India. And so early on, mercantilism, that economic style of like all those resources going to the mother state, back to the mother country, had placed the British East India Company in a monopolistic control of this colony. The Mughal Empire, which was kind of in its decline at this point, had allowed the British exclusive trade rights in the area, allowing them to set up trade posts for tea, coffee, even cotton in India. But as the Mughal Empire implodes and falls apart, the British East India Company then expands into that void very aggressively using this doctrine of lapse. And basically, any region that didn't produce a male heir to justify their claim to that territory, the British East India Company came in and then occupied. Now, the British East India Company itself did have its own army, and they were pretty effective, but they were small. So they supported that effort by hiring local Indians as sepoys, okay? And they would bolster the military of the British. And so here we see the Mughal emperor signing a trade charter with the British East India Company. And here are some sepoys to kind of give you an idea what India's military establishment would have looked like at the time. Now, let's shift our focus over to Africa in an event known as the Scramble for Africa. Now, again, not to bog down, I'm going to try to move fast. So let's do a little contextualization or causation here, right? So if we go back to the 1400s, we talked about the Portuguese sailing down the west coast of Africa and setting up trade posts. And oftentimes, eventually, those were places that had looked to plantation farm sugar, but eventually got into the slave trade. And by 1488, Diaz had gotten into the Indian Ocean, and by the 1490s, we had Da Gama reaching India, right, as they came down the coast of Africa. Now, because slavery had ended, legal trade down the coast of Africa became much more exciting and lucrative, and that generated competition. And so right away, early on, explorers looked to make a name and kind of explore the Dark Continent. And so we have Dr. Livingstone, Dr. Stanley, right? And they're going around looking for the headwaters of the Congo River, the Nile, right? The Zambezi, right? Some of the major rivers in Africa, looking to make territorial claims and do some exploration. Now, an example of a European state that becomes interested is Belgium. Right? So King Leopold II of Belgium hears of all these wonderful resources and all these markets in Africa, and so he starts to explore into the Congo. Okay, and what he finds there is rubber grows there, and so they set up vast rubber plantations. They're tapping rubber trees, and it becomes an absolute nightmare. It's one of the worst atrocities of the 19th century. The death toll is similar to that of the Nazi Holocaust of the 20th century. At least 8 million dead, possibly more. Many more millions have their hands and arms cut off as punishment for not working hard enough. We'll look more at that in a bit. And then also another example would be down in South Africa. Great strategic location. It controls the shipping lanes into the Indian Ocean. And so originally the Portuguese were there, and then the Dutch started settling farmers there. But once gold and diamonds were found, the British became interested, and people like Cecil Rhodes set up a colony. It ended up leading to great conflict with the natives and the Dutch, and the Boer Wars were fought. And so sadly, it leads to great tension, not only between nations, but races eventually. And there's Cecil Rhodes with one foot on Cape Town and the other foot hopefully reaching up to Cairo, and he wants to connect with a railroad, the Cape to Cairo Railroad. Okay. Now, something called the Berlin Conference is eventually called, and the reason why the European powers felt the need to sit down in Berlin at this conference was they wanted to avoid the escalation, the continued growing tension of possible war in Africa. Also, Germany looked to try to show off and flex a little bit because just 10 years earlier, they had become a nation and were looking to prove that they weren't just a country, they were one of the countries. And so here's their chancellor, Otto von Bismarck, leading this meeting. Okay, now the real main policy that came out of the Berlin Conference was the effective occupation. And some people call this the scramble for Africa, but that's actually a bit unfair. So the Europeans agreed to carve up Africa into pieces, and no Africans were allowed to defend this. There are no African representatives there. So Europe just agreed to tear apart a continent. But in order to avoid war, what they agreed upon was that they had to not only publicly claim an area, but in order to keep each other from just taking everything, they had to effectively occupy, meaning improve that location, which meant, in essence, to Eurofy it or to whiteify that area. And so in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s, we start to see African imperialism take on a different look, where we see schools, hospitals, railroads, churches, better marketplaces, stationed militaries in an attempt to prove that they were benefiting the populations living there. So as part of this shift to effective occupation, we also notice that companies like the British East India Company in India, but other trade companies, were starting to be replaced. Oftentimes they were viewed as too brutal, their policies were too harsh, and they didn't have the right equipment to whole-scale reform a society. And so now we see European nations get involved in ruling, either directly, and what direct rule would show is that Europeans would directly control the laws, taxes, and policies, usually by either putting in white European leaders in that region or making decisions back in Europe. Or indirect rule became common, and this eventually would become kind of the British way of business, and we see this even to a degree in India, right, where the British would tap into local tribal leaders or to the local ruling elite and form an alliance. And as long as the local ruling elite did what the British were hoping to accomplish anyway, well, then they would allow that local leadership to stay in place. At the end of the day, what really matters is that we notice a very small population of Europeans, usually 1,000, 2,000 Europeans, controlling a massive population of hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of local inhabitants in a region. Very lopsided. Okay, so lastly, let's look at a couple other other European powers. Not European powers. What am I saying? Other powers that were emulating what Europe was doing. And so the real two that we're looking at here would be America and Japan. Now, it's not U.S. history, but it is worth noting that the 19th century witnessed the rise of America. And so the Monroe Doctrine, illustrated here, was America basically telling the rest of the world to get out of the Western Hemisphere, that America would run the West. And to prove their strength, right, America fought the dying Spanish Empire in the Spanish-American War and eventually claimed territories like the Philippines and Cuba during that war. Now, Japan, on the other hand, we've hinted at before, as part of the Meiji Restoration in Japan, Japan goes into rapid modernization and industrialization. They copy the Western examples of America and Britain. And within only 40 years' time, the Japanese are going crazy, right? So in the Sino-Japanese War, so that's China versus Japan, Japan's navy crushes the Chinese navy. They take territorial claims by Korea, and the world is frightened, is shocked to see how quickly Japan had defeated China, and then how quickly Japan spread out its influence through railroads and naval ports. Now, that put them in direct geopolitical conflict with the Russians, who were also looking to, exert their control in Korea and the Pacific Rim. And so Japan and Russia go into war in the region, and eventually what happens is the Russo-Japanese War. Now, everyone in the world thought that Russia would win this war, and it was a shocking embarrassment. Japan not only won, but it really was only two major naval battles, and it had sunk almost the entire Russian fleet after it had sailed 13,000 miles to get there. And it showed a tipping balance of power, not in white Europe, but in industrial power, right? Because Japan had industrialized, they were now a mega power. And so here's Korea, the shrimp between two whales, Japan and China. Right, and if we look at it, right, this one in the bottom corner shows Russian ships getting absolutely smoked. Over here, we've got the Japanese just firing volley after volley. And the defeat was so crushing that back in Russia, famine was breaking out, there was industrial problems, and then the embarrassment of losing the war, it caused the revolution of 1905, right? Which shows again how sick the Russian economy and politics really were at the time. So Japan, imagine this in the 1860s. Now you've got people riding around on horseback, no navy, no technology, samurai running the place, and then by the 19th century, I mean the turn of the 20th century, they've got this super powerful navy, they've got machine guns, European style military, heavy industrialization, and they've knocked off China and Russia. I mean, they are truly a world power on the climb, and they will keep climbing right up through World War II. All right, so I'm going to pause here, and then we'll finish by looking at some of the responses and the effects of imperialism. All right, stay tuned for the last look. All right, I'll catch you soon.